The Occult Book, A Chronological Journey from Alchemy to Wicca by John Michael Greer, Part 1. In most of the world's cultures and through of the most world's history, the things that people in the modern Western world consider occults, amulets, and talismans, omens, and divinations, spells and charms, spirits good and evil, are simply part of everyday life. If you go to a Shinto shrine in Japan, for example, or to a temple of one of the traditional religions of West Africa, you can count on seeing things done there that would qualify as occultism in Europe or America. In these societies, nothing set those apart from any other body of traditional knowledge. People engage in them all the time without ever suspecting that they are doing something secret, forbidden, or irrational. In the Western world, for complicated historical reasons, this hasn't been the case. Instead, starting in Roman times and accelerating with the triumph of Christianity, what we know as the occult was set apart as forbidden lore. From the first stirrings of anti-cult hysteria through the horrors of the burning times when hundreds of thousands of people were tortured and executed on suspicion of practicing magic, tremendous social pressures backed by the threat of violence fell on anyone who took an interest in the occult. Yet the occult traditions of the Western world managed to survive all that, finding new practitioners in every generation. The astonishing story of suppression, survival, and rebirth extending over more than 2.5 millennia is the subject of this book. The word occult literally means hidden, and its application to what we now call the occult has a long history. During the Renaissance, writers who wanted to refer to magic, divination, and alternative spirituality connected with them began to use the term occult philosophy, that is, hidden philosophy, for those subjects. The habit became permanent when Cornelius Agrippa titled his great textbooks of Renaissance magic 3 books of occult philosophy. Later, during the revival of magic in the 19th century, French authors started using the word occultism in English for the same subjects. It can be useful to think of occultism as the rejected knowledge of the Western world. Every society has some body of knowledge that has been condemned by the intellectual authorities of the time, but still is studied and taught outside the normal channels of education and public opinion. In industrial nations today, the explosive growth of knowledge has been matched by an equally explosive growth in rejected knowledge. And much of this has nothing to do with occultism. Still, the occult remains the oldest and the most savagely persecuted of all the Western world bodies of rejected knowledge. Among the core elements of occultism are these: magic, the science and art of causing changes in consciousness at will. According to its great 20th century practitioner, Dion Fortune, the magic or practitioner of magic uses rituals, symbolism, meditation, and other methods to enter into unusual states of consciousness in which, accordingly to occult teachings, subtle powers can be directed and disembodied entities contacted to cause changes in the world. Divination, more commonly known as fortune telling, this is the art of knowing hidden things in the present and the secrets of the future through the same subtle links that in occult tradition make magic work. The tarot card reader who shuffles and deals cards, the astrologer who studies the positions of the planets at a particular moment, and diviners using other methods all try to tap into the flow of unseen forces that will allow them to glimpse the unknown. Initiation, the process by which an ordinary person develops the powers and abilities needed to master magic and divination. There are many methods of initiation, but the most famous are elaborate ceremonies that enact symbolic dramas, catalytic changes in consciousness of the new initiate. The mystery rituals of ancient Greece were famous initiation in their time. More recently, the rituals of magical lodges, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the Martinist Order, serve the same function. Alchemy, often dismissed by modern scientists as a failed attempt to turn lead into gold. Alchemy is a far more diverse and far more practical. To an alchemist, every material substance has a potential for perfection, and the methods of alchemy are used to help each substance achieve its perfection. Alchemists thus prepare herbal medicines, practice spiritual meditation, and work with a dazzling array of substances in their pursuit of hidden knowledge. Occult philosophy. Underlying these occult practices is a philosophy that explains how and why occultism works. Three main occults of occult philosophy have played a predominant role in the history of occultism. Neoplatonism, an offshoot of philosophy of Plato, emerged in ancient Greece. Hermeticism, a blend of Greek philosophy and Egyptian magical teaching, had its start in Egypt. And Kabbalah, also spelled Kabbala and Qabalah. The most recent of the three was born in the Jewish communities of southern France. All three having strong similarities with one another and draw on many of the same sources. These core ingredients, combined with one another and with the assortment of other practices and teachings, make up the heart of the occult traditions of the West. From the 16th century BCE, when the first known occult school was found in the Western world by Pythagoras of Samos, they have been handed down, sometimes publicly and sometimes in secret, sometimes by way of organizations such as the Rosicrucians, and sometimes from individuals, teachers to students, all the way to the present. The pages that follow present and 100 important events in the history of occultism, stations, if you will, along the road that leads from Pythagoras to the present day. It is a long and winding journey that covers the whole range of human possibility, from the heights of spiritual aspirations to the depths of folly and fraud. And an uncomfortably long part of the route is made hideous by the screams of the tortured and the scent of burning flesh. Where will the road lead next as the occult traditions of today respond to the challenges of tomorrow? No one knows, but the transformations through which occultism already has passed suggest that its story is far from over. 6th century BCE, Pythagoras comes to Crotona. The Greek colonial city of Crotona in southern Italy was a thriving metropolis in the 6th century BCE and attracted immigrants from every part of the bustling Greek world. None of them will become as famous as a middle-aged man who came there sometime in the second half of that century. His name was Pythagoras. 570 BCE through 495 BCE, and his arrival in Crotona marks the dawn of the history of the occultism in the Western world. Born in Samos, off the coast of what is now Turkey, Pythagoras left his homeland in search of knowledge, studying with the philosophers Thales and Miletus and Phersides of Saros. Unsatisfied with their instruction, he set sail for Egypt, where he studied with the priests of Thebes for a time, and then traveled to Babylon to learn what the astrologers, priests of that land had to teach. Finally, he returned to the Greek world and was initiated into mystery cults in Greece and Crete before finally settling in Crotona. There he set up an order, a Pythagorean brotherhood, to pass on the teachings he had learned in his journeys. Those who joined the school lived under a vow of silence for the first 5 years and only then were admitted into their inner teachings of the order. Little is known about those teachings, but they certainly include belief in reincarnation, the meaning of numbers and geometry, and rules governing everyday life. Late in the 6th century, the Pythagorean Brotherhood invented the Crotonus politics, supporting the aristocratic party against the democratic party. When the aristocrats lost, a mob burned down the headquarters of the Brotherhood. Survivors of the Brotherhood scattered throughout the Greek world, carrying Pythagoras' teachings with them. From them and their students, the traditions of Western occultism ultimately descend. 5th century BCE, Empedocles invents the 4 elements. The mathematical mysticism of Pythagoras, hugely influential through it went on to be, found few takers in the most busy world of ancient Greek philosophy. Most thinkers of that time argued that behind the world we experienced there had been to be a single source from which everything else came into being, and most of them argued that the source had to be a material substance. Thales and Miletus, the first Greek philosopher, argued that the source was water. Heraclitus thought that it was fire, and others had different opinions. Empedocles, 495 BCE through 432 BCE, the man who would combine those beliefs into an enduring synthesis, was born in the Greek colonial city of Akragas in Sicily. He took on an active part in the rough and tumble politics of his hometown, was exiled to Greece, and supposedly committed suicide by flinging himself into the cradle of the volcano Vesuvius. At some point in his busy life, he found time to write 2 long poems, Purifications on Religion and on Nature. The first statement of the theory of the 4 elements. To Empedocles, the sheer diversity of the world showed that there could be no single source of everything. Instead, he argued 4 basic substances, fire, air, water, and earth, made up all things by combining and separating. Empedocles was onto something when scientists today describe the world as being made up of solids, liquid gases, and energy. They're using Empedocles' clarifications under other names. It was through the emerging traditions of the Western occultism that Empedocles' theory would find its lasting home. The habit of dividing the world into the 4 categories of fiery, eerie, watery, and earthly things proved so useful to magi's, diviners, and other occultists that the 4 elements became far and away the most influential set of symbolism in occult theory and practice. 347 BCE, death of Plato. His real name was Aristocles of Athens, but everyone called him Plato because of his very broad shoulder. Plato, a famous wrestler in his youth, Plato, 428 BCE, 347 BCE, took up philosophy at the age of 20 and became the foremost disciple of Socrates. When his teacher was executed by the Athenian government in 399 BCE, Plato left his hometown for Megara, where he studied geometry with the famous mathematician Euclid. Thereafter, he traveled around the Mediterranean world as Pythagoras had, studying wisdom wherever he could and getting into and out of an assortment of scrapes. Finally, he returned to Athens and founded a school, the Academy, which survived long after his death. Plato's philosophy was strongly influenced by the teachings of Pythagoras and Empedocles. He taught that beyond the world known by our 5 senses, the world of becoming, lay the world of being. Everything we experience in the world of becoming is a reflection of eternal patterns that exist in the world of being, and the task of the true philosopher is to get past the misleading data provided by the same senses and know the world of being directly with the mind. There was no trace of occultism in Plato's published dialogues, and only a few hints concerning unwritten teachings in a few letters attributing to him. None of this kept occultists from adopting Platonic philosophy as a guiding theory for their work, and they did across the ancient Greek world. After his death, a bitter time of troubles settled over the Greek islands. More and more intellectuals turned away from the rationalist philosophies that had done so little to keep their society on an even keel and explored the occultist traditions of Greece and the countries around it. In that process, many of the foundations of latter occultism took shape. 186 BCE, Rome outlaws the Bacchic mysteries. Religious intolerance was rare in ancient times. People who believed in many gods and goddesses rarely took offense if their neighbors prayed to a different set of deities. This tolerance, though, broke down rapidly if a religious movement got involved in politics or crime. This is what happened to the cult of the Bacchic mysteries in 186 BCE in ancient Rome. It found its way to Italy in the late 3rd century BCE and spread to Rome not long afterward. Originally, it admitted only women, held its rituals in the daytime, and did nothing inappropriate. The third priestess of the Bacchic mysteries in Rome, Peculiania, began to admit men to the rituals and started holding the ceremonies at night. Later accounts claim that the rituals turned into orgies and the mystery cult became a criminal organization whose members covered up one another's misdeeds and murdered those who refused to participate. When rumors reached the Roman authorities, the response was sudden and drastic. The Roman Senate ordered every initiative of the Bacchic mysteries arrested. Some escaped, but more than 6,000 were arrested. More than half of them were found guilty of criminal activities and put to death, and the Bacchic mysteries were outlawed throughout Roman territory. The most important consequence of the prohibition of the Bacchic mysteries, though, was a legal precedent it set. Thereafter, Roman law considered secret religious ceremonies as a potential criminal and political threat, and any religious group that held rituals in private was automatically suspect. That precedent helped drive the persecutions of Christians in the early Roman Empire, but it was also applied to the traditions that gave birth to occultism, and in that way helped lay the foundations for witch burnings 15 centuries later. 1st century BCE, Miriam the alchemist. One of the greatest cities of the ancient world, founded by Alexander the Greek on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, Alexandria became the main point of contact between the religious and magical teachings of the Egyptians and the philosophies and initiations of the Greeks. From the bubbling cauldron of traditions that resulted from that blending came many core elements of Western occultism, among them alchemy. Alchemy was and is considerably more than the attempt to turn base metals into gold. To an alchemist, all material things ripen toward perfection unless something gets in its way. The alchemist's mission is to remove the obstacles that keep material things from attaining their perfection. For metals, that perfection is gold. For the human body, health. For the human spirit, union with the divine. And all these and many more are appropriate goals for alchemical work. To enable material substance to achieve perfection, certain pieces of laboratory gear are needed. Some of the most important of these devices were invented sometime in the 1st century BCE by a Jewish alchemist in Alexandria, a woman named Miriam. Little is known about the life of Mary, the Jewess, as she generally is called in later alchemical writings. The fact is that she was a brilliant inventor, though it is clear from the devices she created. One of them, the chirotakis, allowed metals to be exposed to corrosive vapors without letting those vapors get into the alchemist's lungs. Another, a still with 3 spouts at different heights, was the first equipment for fractional distillation. Her most famous creation, though, was Balnimu Marie, Miriam's bath, the double boiler, she invented it to provide steady, even heat to the alchemy process. Chefs use it today to cook delicate sauces without burning them, and the French still call this device a bain-marie. 33 CE, death of Jesus. According to this 4 official biographers and the faith of 20 centuries of devout believers, Yeshua ben Maryam, now more commonly known as Jesus Christ, was the Son of God, born to a Jewish virgin who performed miracles, founded the Christian religion, and died on the cross to redeem humanity. That understanding is so deeply ingrained in the cultures of the Western world that it can be a shock to realize that for centuries after a lifetime, a great many people in the Roman world interpreted Jesus in a very different way as a practitioner of magic. Jewish literature from the 1st century CE names Jesus ben Pentara, the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier, by a Jewish woman who went to Egypt as a migrant worker, learned magic there, and attracted a following after his return to Judea. The identical story appears in the surviving fragments of a work by a pagan philosopher, Celsus, against the Christians. Many early Christian writers mentioned versions of this belief, as it was one of the principal arguments against which they had to contend. Other Magi's apparently share the same opinion. The name of Jesus appeared early and often on amulets and in books of spells as a world of power that can be used to command spirits. And the 2 of the 3 earliest portrayals of the crucifixions are on magical amulets surrounded by incarnations. This narrative that Jesus of Nazareth was a Jewish sorcerer whose followers redefined him as a god after his death presented a struggle for newborn Christianity. In fact, this belief probably played an important role in the fear and hatred with which mainstream Christianity has regarded occultism ever since. 57 CE, fall of Mona. When Greeks and Romans first made their way into the Celtic nations of Gaul, today France, Britain, and Ireland, they found a caste of scholars and lore masters known as Druids. That term probably meant something like wise ones of the oak, but no one today knows for sure. This is one of the ancient mysteries surrounding the ancient Druids. At first, literate people in the Greek and Roman worlds were fascinated by the Druids and assigned them the same status that 20th century Americans gave to gurus from India. That changed as Rome targeted the Celtic lands for conquest. In 121 BCE, the Romans seized part of the southern Gaul. Between 58 and 51 BCE, Julius Caesar conquered the rest of Gaul and carried out 2 raids on Britain. In 433 CE, the invasion of Britain began in earnest, and by 48, all of what is now England and portions of Scotland and Wales were in Roman hands. The Druids played an important role in the resistance to Roman invasion in Gaul and Britain, helping to rally the defenders and coordinate military actions between different tribes. In response, Rome targeted the Druids for extermination. Roman edicts proscribed the Druids of Gaul as soon as Julius Caesar's conquest was complete, and in Britain, the destruction of the Druids and their sacred places proceeded along with the conquest. The final blow came in 57 when a Roman force crossed the strait from northern Wales to the islands of Mona, a Druid holy place that had become the last refuge of the embattled Druids. The Roman victory there was followed by a general massacre. Thereafter, Druids remained only in Ireland, Scotland, and the unconquered hill country of Wales until Christian missionaries penetrated where Roman legions could not go. I know that I hung on the windy tree, nightful nights, pierced by a spear, offered to Odin, myself to myself, upon that tree of which none knows where its roots runs. In these lines, part of the Old Norse poem, Hatvamo, Words of the Most High, the god Odin described the act of self-sacrifice that won him the runes, the magical alphabet of the Germanic peoples. For more than 1,000 years, descendants of those tribes in Central Europe, Scandinavia, and Britain used the stark, angular, runic letters for religious and magical as well as practical purposes. Historians who have to depend on written records and archaeological evidence rather than the words of pagan deities have traced the origin of the runes to what is now known in southern Germany sometime before 50 CE, the date of the first known runic inscription. Once inverted, it quickly took on an important symbolic, spiritual, and magical role and kept those roles throughout the migrations that followed the collapse of Rome and the long and troubled Dark Age that ensued. Runic alphabets were called Futharks or Futhorks after the first 6 runes, which stand for the sounds F, U, V, or O, R, N, C, or K. The oldest known version of the runes, the elder Futhark, had 24 letters. The younger Futhark of Viking times had only 16, and the Anglo-Saxon people who settled England after the fall of the Roman Empire went in the other direction and created the Anglo-Saxon, furthermore, Futhark of 29 or 33 letters. With the coming of Christianity, the runes dropped from use or went underground along with the rest of the Norse and Germanic pagan traditions. There they would remain until the 17th century when their modern revival began. 1st century CE, Apollonius of Tyana. Very little is known for certain about the most famous Magi of the Roman world. The biography of Apollonius of Tyana, 15 CE through 100 CE, was written more than a century after his death by the Greek author Philostratus, who, like the biographers of that other miracle worker from the 1st century CE, Jesus of Nazareth, packed the tale with exciting stories but never got around to including many historical details. He was born in the town of Tyana in what is now southern Turkey. In his adolescent years, he was deeply impressed by the teachings of Pythagoras and decided to become a disciple of the Pythagorean Brotherhood. The fact that the Brotherhood no longer existed was no obstacle. Apollonius devoted himself to all of the disciplines and austerities Pythagoras would have imposed on him, including the 5-year vow of silence. Later, he embarked on travels throughout the Roman world, seeking wisdom. If Philostratus is to be believed, he even ventured east through the Persian Empire to the distant land of India to study with its sages. All the while, his reputation as a holy man grew. Like Jesus of Nazareth, he was particularly well known for healing the sick and banishing demons, and was said to have raised a girl from the dead. When a jealous rival got him in trouble with the Roman government, he went to Rome, defended himself before the imperial courts, won an acquittal, and then suddenly disappeared from the courtroom and was seen the same day in another town many miles away. Unlike his partial equivalent from Judea, Apollonius died of old age. For centuries after his time, talismans based on his designs were used to ward off shipwreck, vermin, and dangerous beasts, but no religion was found in his name. C. 120. Basileus of Alexandria. Plato, in his dialogue, The Statesman, used the term Gnostiko, the capable of knowing. for the people he thought should run society. Many philosophers, including Plato's followers, used the same term off and on in the years that followed. Around the beginning of the Christian era, though, it came to have a different meaning. Those who were capable of knowing the mysteries of the spiritual world, members of a secretive movement that fused Plato's philosophy with elements from Egyptian, Greek, and Christian thought to create a new spirituality deeply tingled with occultism. We know them today as Gnostics. No one is sure where the first Gnostics emerged, but Alexandria is likely a guess. Certainly that was where the first important Gnostic leader lived and taught. His name was Balasides of Alexandria. The only surviving scraps of his teaching appear in the writings of latter Christian hearsays, hunters, and those records are so sparse that only the bare outlines are clear. Like the latter Gnostics, though, Balasides taught that the human soul had descended from a world of light into the darkness of matter and was trapped there by the mechanics of an evil god, Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, who had created the material world. Jesus, he taught, had come down from the world of light to reach the fallen how to return to their home. Following with the teachings of Jesus as they understood them, Gnostics practiced demanding spiritual disciplines and learned the words of power that would enable them to vanquish Yaldabaoth's demons. When Gnosticism first emerged in the 2nd century CE, Christianity was still a scattered sect with no political power and little doctrinal consistency. Most of 3 centuries would pass before that changed, and when it did, the Gnostics faced savage persecution from Orthodox Christians. 2nd century, magic on trial. It was a math made in heaven, or so Lucius Appuleius, 124 through 170, must have thought on his way home from Athens with his school friend Socinius had fallen sick on the road, and Socinius took him home where his recently widowed mother, Amelia, took care of the handsome young student. Amelia was young, beautiful, well-educated, and rich. She and Lucius promptly fell in love and got married. The fly in the ointment was Amelia's relatives, who were not amused by the young widow's sudden remarriage. They accused Lucius of using love magic to seduce Amelia and filed charges with the local Roman officials. The accusations wasn't completely absurd because Lucius had been studying Platonic philosophy in Athens, and the blending of magic with Plato's philosophy was already well underway by this time. Fortunately, Lucius also had studied rhetoric and was more than well qualified to defend himself in court. When he was brought to the trial before the Roman procurator, all charges were dismissed. Lucius' speech survives and provides an intriguing glimpse into beliefs about occultism in the heyday of Rome. Lucius and Amelia then did the sensible thing and moved away from her relatives. They settled at Carthage, where he became a famous orator, teacher, and author. His most famous book, the only surviving Roman novel, is The Golden Ass. It tells the story of a young idiot named Lucius who is turned into a donkey by a witch and goes through a series of madcap adventures before being returned to human form by the goddess Isis. Like Lucius' speech, it contains a great deal of information about occultism in Roman times. 155. Valentinus loses a papal election. Born in a small town in Egypt's Nile Delta, Valentinus, 100 through 160, went to Alexandria to seek an education. A devout Christian and before long an ordained priest, he studied with Theudas, one of the original disciples of the Apostle Paul, and gained a reputation for scholarship and personal sanctity by like many Christians at that time. He was also a agnostic. In 136, he went to Rome. Those were the years when authority among Christians in the western half of the empire were starting to centralize, and the position of Bishop of Rome had begun to turn into the office of a pope. Valentinus hoped to inherit that office on the death of the incumbent Hyginus. When Hyginus died in 142, however, Pius I was elected in his place. Pius was a fierce opponent of agnosticism and one of the leading champions of what would become Christian orthodoxy in the years to come. His election was a blow to the entire agnostic movement. Valentinus was still relatively young, though, and he remained in Rome teaching and writing in the hope that the death of Pius would clear the way to papacy. When Pius first died in 155, however, Anticetus, another Orthodox churchman, was elected in his place. Valentinus left Rome shortly afterward and went to the island of Cyprus, where he taught until his death. In the wake of his defeat, his many followers left Christian congregations to found churches of their own. Believers in other alternative versions of Christian teachings did the same thing, and in their absence, the drift of the Christian church toward a harshly defended dogmatic proceeded unchecked. 3rd century, the Corpus Hermeticum, the fusion of Greek philosophy and Egyptian mystery teaching that gave rise to alchemy and Gnosticism, had other consequences, one of which would have the immense influence on the history of occultism. This was a collection of writings called the Corpus Hermeticum, a set of 15 short treatises supposedly written by an Egyptian sage named Hermes Trismegistus in ancient times. They were actually the product of a school of mystics that flourished in Egypt between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, who accredited the legendary founder of their school with the authorship of their writings. Like the Gnostics, the followers of Hermes believed that humanity descended into a world of matter from a higher realm and could find salvation only by rising above matter. They rejected the Gnosticism, claimed that the universe was the evil creation of an evil God, and taught self-discipline, occult philosophy, alchemy, astrology, and magic, which would lead to a rebirth in which the initiate reconnected with the spiritual realm and its divine powers. Copies of the Corpus Hermeticum, along with many other writings of the same general sort, spread widely through the Roman world during the last centuries of paganism and played a significant role in the occult spirituality of that era. The most important impact of the Corpus Hermeticum on the history of occultism, though, came many centuries later. One copy of the collection survived the centuries of the Christian persecution of occultism and eventually found its way to the Renaissance of Italy. When it was translated, the version of the spirituality centered on occultism burst like a bombshell over the European world and set traditions and motions that are still alive. 244. Plotinus begins teaching in Rome. By the 3rd century CE, the great age of classical philosophy was long past, but many people in the Roman Empire still read the Greek philosophers and discussed their teachings. A capable thinker with a unique take on the core questions of philosophy could attract an audience and found a school, and that was what Plotinus did when he arrived in Rome in 244 CE. Plotinus was born in Egypt and studied in Alexandria for 11 years with Ammonius, an important Plotinus philosopher. In 243, he joined Emperor Gordian's invasions of the Persian Empire, but Gordian was assassinated by his own soldiers and Plotinus had a difficult time making his way back to safety within Roman borders. This experience seemed to have cured him of any further taste for adventure. He settled in Rome and began offering lectures on philosophy shortly after and stayed there until just before his death. His teachings started from Plato's basic division between the world of being and the world of becoming, but unfolded them in a more mystical direction. He taught his students to use contemplation to commune with the world of being, and he also portrayed the basic patterns of the world of being as intelligent beings. Later generations would identify them as the gods and goddesses of pagan religion, or the angels and the archangels of the Christian faith. He criticized the Gnostics harshly, but his own teaching had important features in common with theirs, including a great interest in how magic and astrology worked. Plotinus' revision of Plato's teaching, which is called Neoplatonism by modern scholars, became the last great school of philosophy in the classical world. It also became the foundation on which most latter occultists based their theories and practices. C. 300. Zosimos of Panopolis. 4 centuries after the time of Miriam the alchemist, alchemy was still thriving in the great Egyptian metropolis of Alexandria. As it was there, that was one of the most important ancient alchemy authors thrived around the year 300 CE. His name was Zosimos, and he was born in the town of Panopolis and in the southern part of Egypt, as he visited the ancient city of Memphis to inspect an ancient alchemy furnace. Those are essential, the only facts about his life that survives. His writings, however, reveal much about the Alexandrian alchemy scene in his time. He had access to the writings of many previous alchemists and considered the work of Miriam the alchemist particularly valuable. He also knew the spiritual literature of his time and was strongly influenced by the Corpus Hermeticum, which he quoted with approval in several places. To him, alchemy dealt with as much with the spiritual transformation as with material substances. Some of his most influential writings took the form of vivid dream sequences in which mysterious persons and places hinted at the deeper secrets of alchemy. Whether or not he was first to do this, his writing played an important role in making myth, metaphor, and symbolic imagery central to later alchemy literature. Several of Zosimos' books were addressed to another alchemist, a woman named Theosebia, who was also respected as a teacher of alchemy. The two of them apparently had a running disagreement about secrecy. Theosebia held the traditional view that alchemy was only to be passed on to select pupils under an oath of silence, whereas Zosimos believed that alchemy ought to be shared with all. No record survives of Theosebia's side of the argument, but history shows that her point of view won the debate. 330. Death of Ambilicus of Chalcis. By the late 3rd century, Christianity was a rising power throughout a Roman world. Unlike pagan religions, Christianity wasn't committed to a crumbling status quo. Its appeal to the poor and downtrodden made it immensely attractive in an age of social and economic turmoil. But there were still plenty of people whose loyalty lay with the old ways and who sought to unite pagans in a defensive allegiance against the new faith. The most successful of them was Ambilicus of Chalcis, 250 through 330. Born into an upper-class family in Roman Syria, he studied Plato's philosophy with the great teachings Anatolius and Porphyry. In his youth, philosophy and pagan religion were still at odds with each other. His teacher Porphyry for example, denounced the tradition pagan customs of animal sacrifice. Iambelicus, on the contrast, set out to find common ground between philosophy and religion. He did that by completing the fusion of Platonic philosophy and occultism. Iambelicus saw that the traditional magical and religious practices of the ancient world could be reimagined as aids to the mystical vision of the reality Plato and Plotinus had discussed. He named this new application of magic theurgy, the divine work. In his writings, especially on the mysteries, he explained how every aspect of traditional pagan religion and magic made sense in Platonic terms and therefore could be practiced and defended by intellectuals as well as ordinary Romans. Iambelicus was swimming against the tide, and his attempt to counter the spread of Christianity with a resurgent paganism would fail. In the short term, though, it sparked the last great upsurge in classical occultism, and in the long term, his writings and the theurgy he taught would become powerful influence on occult traditions millennia later. 363, last pagan emperor of Rome. In 313, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, removing all the legal penalties against Christianity and giving the Christian church a variety of privileges. Christians responded by going on the offense against paganism, supported by the imperial government, which made Christians, monks, and priests immune from persecution. Before the triumph of the new religion, however, an improbable series of events brought a pagan philosopher to a throne. As a son of Constantine's half-brother, Julian, c. 331 through 363, received a pious Christian education but rejected Christianity in favor of the old pagan gods. He studied in Ephesus and Athens and embraced the magical Neoplatonism that Iambelicus had taught. Then a new conqueror, Constantine's son, Constantinatus II, placed Julian in charge of Britain and Gaul. The young man turned out to be a competent general and administrator, defeating barbarians on the frontier and reforming the local government. Constantius, a fanatical Christian, became jealous of his cousin. Julian's soldiers proclaimed him emperor, and when Constantius died suddenly in 361, the whole Roman world acknowledged Julian as the heir of the Caesars. He moved quickly to proclaim toleration for all religions, reinstate pagan temples and priesthoods where they had been abolished, and remove privilege from the Christian clergy. In 362, though, rising tensions with the Persian empires forced him to leave the capital at Constantinople and join the armies in the east. Early the next year, he led the Roman armies to victory near Ctesiphon, but was mortally wounded shortly afterwards. With him died the last hope of classical paganism, and his involvement with theurgy helped lay the groundwork for the centuries of persecution that occultism suffered thereafter. 396. End of the Eleusinian Mysteries. For 2,000 years, maybe more, the ceremonies had been celebrated every autumn in the small town of Eleusis, near Athens, becoming more famous and elaborate with the passing years. By Roman times, the mystery temple at Eleusis was a huge building half the size of a football field, and people came there from the far corners of the ancient world. All new initiates had to go through preliminary ceremonies at the river Eleusis in the month of Anthesterion, our February, in which they offered sacrifices, cleansed themselves in the water, and listened to instruction. A year and a half later, in Bodromion, our September, they marched to Eleusis, arriving at dusk. They entered the temple, and the ceremony of the initiating was enacted. No one today knows what it was, but ancient writers agree that those who passed through it had no fear of death afterward. Even after Christianity seized power, the mysteries of Eliseus continued for a time and then flourished anew during Julian's brief reign, when a new emperor issued an edict in 384 prohibiting nocturnal pagan meetings. That proconsul of Greece, Vetetius Augurius Protextatus, defied the order at the risk of his life and position. Still, politics among the remaining pagans and increasing pressure from Christian zealots troubled the last year of the mysteries. Finally, in 396, the barbarian Visigoths invaded Greece. They were recent converts to Christianity and looted and wrecked pagan sanctuaries throughout the country, including Eleusis. Though small groups of pagans kept up a semblance of the old rites elsewhere for many years thereafter, the destruction of the temple marked the end of the Eleusinian mysteries in their traditional form. 538. The Edicts of Justinian. None of the remaining pagans in the Roman world had any doubt about what was coming, but the end still must have been a shock. In 538, the Emperor Justinian stripped every non-Christian and every Christian heretic in the empire of all their civil rights and ordered the closing of all and every pagan educational and cultural institution. Protests on the part of the pagan minority were suppressed by government troops, and the long history of paganism in the ancient world was over. In response, some of the remaining pagans chose a desperate expedient and journeyed eastward to the borders of the empire. Some found a home in the Persian Empire, which had a far more tolerant attitude toward religion than Rome did. Others traveled far still into Central Asia and the outermost provinces of the Chinese Empire, where Christian heresies also found a welcoming home. A significant number, though, settled in Haran. This town had existed since the 3rd millennium BCE, nestled in a valley in what is now southern eastern Turkey, a city of mud brick houses surrounded by green fields and low brown hills. The Sumerians, who found it as a trading post, dedicated it to their moon god Sin, but it absorbed religious and magical traditions from countless peoples as the Middle East passed through the long cycles of its history. The coming of Christianity and the legal proscription of paganism had surprisingly little impact on Haran, a border town on the troubled frontier between the Roman and Persian empires. It could afford to ignore Roman laws banning pagan worship. Over the years that followed, Haran became the last holdout of the pagan Neoplatonism of the Ambilicus and Julian, teaching a version of pagan worship laced with occult teachings and practices. 573. Merlin and the Battle of Ardeaid. His real name was probably a rounded-off form of Ambrosius, and he never met with the hard-bitten Roman British warlord, who is remembered now as King Arthur. But Merlin the Enchanter was apparently a real person. He lived in the Scottish lowlands during the 6th century, and fragments of his biography survived long enough to be woven into a romance by the medieval author Geoffrey Monmouth. Britain in the 6th century was ravaged by warfare. Saxon warriors from what is now the northeastern coast of Germany had been invited there to serve as a mercenary force, only to turn on their employers and carve out territory for themselves. The British people were unable to unite against the Saxons for many reasons, including religious strife that divided Christians from pagans and set them at war with one another. In 573, at the Battle of Ardeaid, the last pagan ruler in Britain south of the Highlands was defeated and killed by a Christian army. The king's name was Gwendolyn, and the original Merlin was his court poet and very possibly his druid priest. Merlin's elegy for his fallen king is among the oldest surviving poems in the Welsh language. How Merlin's story got attached to the body of tales surrounding King Arthur is hard to say, but such things have happened many times in the history of legends. Once he had got attached to the enormously popular Arthurian stories, though Merlin quickly became the archetype on which most latter wizards were molded, and prophecies ghostwritten for him by industrial authors became as popular as in Middle Ages as the predictions of Nostradamus are today.